The alarm rang before dawn, pulling David from a restless sleep. He rubbed his eyes, already weary, knowing the day would demand more from him than he had left to give. Being a single father meant every morning was a delicate balancing act, packing lunches, ironing uniforms, remembering field trip slips, and making sure breakfast wasn't forgotten in the chaos. His daughter, Sophie, still half asleep, shuffled into the kitchen in her wrinkled pajamas. Her hair was tangled, her small backpack left unzipped at the corner of the couch. David managed a tired smile as he hurried to pour cereal into a bowl while mentally running through the list of tasks ahead. Work deadlines loomed, but Sophie's needs always came first. He had promised himself that no matter how heavy life felt, she would never feel the weight of it. This morning, though, felt heavier than most. His shirt was missing a button. His tie had a stain from yesterday's rush lunch, and the coffee pot sputtered weakly as if mocking his exhaustion. Still, he moved quickly, juggling each task with the determination of a man who knew he had no choice but to keep going. By the time they were ready to leave, the minutes had slipped away faster than he realized. Sophie clutched her backpack while he balanced his travel mug of coffee and her lunchbox in the same hand. The morning air was brisk as they hurried to the car, David fumbling with keys, while Sophie reminded him about a permission slip he'd forgotten to sign. As they pulled out of the driveway, David's heart pounded with the urgency of time slipping away. Sophie's school bell would ring soon, and being late was an option. He sipped his coffee at a red light, hoping the warmth would clear the fog in his mind. But in his rush, his hand slipped. The lid wasn't tightened properly. A stream of hot coffee spilled down his shirt and onto the console, searing his skin and staining his already disheveled clothes. Sophie gasped softly, her eyes wide, but David forced a quick breath, brushing it off with a practiced calm he didn't feel. The light turned green, and he drove on, the sting of the burn mixing with the sting of frustration. Another mess, another reminder of how fragile his balance really was. After dropping Sophie at the school gate with a kiss on her forehead and a reassuring smile, David sat in the car for a moment, staring at the brown stain spreading across his shirt. The thought of walking into work like this felt unbearable. He knew he had to fix it somehow before facing his colleagues. On impulse, he drove to a small cafe a few blocks from the school. It wasn't part of his routine, but he needed napkins, maybe another coffee, and a moment to gather himself before the day truly began. As he pushed open the door, the warm scent of roasted beans wrapped around him, calming his racing heart. He didn't know it yet, but this small detour, born of a clumsy mistake, was about to change the course of his life. The cafe door closed behind David with a soft chime, muffling the city's morning rush outside. Inside, the world felt slower, calmer. The air carried the earthy warmth of ground beans, mixed with the sweet hint of pastries lying neatly behind the glass counter. For a moment, he simply stood there, allowing himself to breathe. His shirt was still damp, the stain spreading in a messy splash across his chest, but the aroma of coffee wrapped him in a strange sense of comfort. He approached the counter awkwardly, fumbling for a few napkins while the barista offered a polite smile. Behind him, the line of customers shifted, each lost in their own morning rituals. David felt exposed, painfully aware how disheveled he looked among the polished suits and carefully dressed patrons. His tie hung unevenly, his shirt bore the mark of his clumsiness, and fatigue etched itself across his face. It was then that he noticed her. Standing just behind him in line, holding a small notebook and a calm expression, was a woman who seemed untouched by the hurried energy of the morning. She wasn't impatient, nor did she avert her gaze the way most strangers did in crowded spaces. Instead, she watched him with a softness that disarmed him completely. When he dropped one of the napkins in his rush to clean his shirt, she bent slightly, handing it back before he could reach for it. Their eyes met briefly. Hers were kind, steady, and without judgment. David muttered a quiet thanks under his breath, though he didn't realize how much that single gesture soothed him. He moved to the side of the counter, blotting his shirt with a stack of napkins, feeling clumsy and out of place. Yet, instead of turning away, the woman lingered, her coffee order forgotten as she noticed the depth of his weariness. Something about him, about the way he carried both strength and exhaustion in equal measure, stirred a quiet compassion in her. David finally ordered a fresh cup, hoping to salvage what little dignity he had left before heading into the day. As he reached for his wallet, the barista shook her head, pointing to the register where the woman had already paid for his drink. He blinked in surprise, his throat tightening with the unexpected gesture. It was such a small thing, a cup of coffee, already bought and waiting, but to him, it felt like something much larger. In the middle of a morning filled with spilled messes and silent battles, here was someone who saw him, not as a burden or a spectacle, but as a person worthy of kindness. The woman gave a small nod when their eyes met again, as if to assure him it was nothing. But David carried the warmth of that act deeper than the coffee could ever reach. It wasn't just the caffeine he needed. It was a reminder that even in his loneliest, most frantic moments, the world still had room for grace. As he left the cafe with his new cup in hand, he glanced back once more. She was still there, notebook open now, her pen moving steadily across the page. He didn't know her name. He didn't know why she had chosen him, a stranger in a stained shirt, for that quiet moment of generosity. But as he stepped into the sunlight, he knew one thing with certainty. What began as an accident had opened a door he hadn't realized was still possible to walk through. The days that followed settled back into their familiar rhythm. David rose early, packed his daughter's lunch, and navigated the morning chaos of misplaced shoes and forgotten homework. Life as a single father demanded structure, even if that structure was messy and stitched together with little more than determination. Yet, no matter how ordinary the days appeared, one memory lingered like a soft glow at the edge of his mind. The stranger at the cafe with kind eyes and an act of generosity that had touched him more deeply than he expected. He told himself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of kindness in a city where strangers rarely pause for one another. Still, when he drove past the cafe, he found his thoughts wandering to her. Did she sit there every morning with her notebook? Was she someone who made kindness a habit, or had he simply been in the right place at the right time? On a Thursday morning, with his daughter finally settled into her classroom after a cheerful goodbye, David found himself drawn back to Café. He didn't plan it. It was more like an instinct guiding him. Inside, the same warm aroma welcomed him, familiar now and oddly comforting. He ordered as usual, resisting the urge to glance around too obviously, and waited quietly at the counter. And then he saw her, at the same table by the window, notebook open, pen in hand. She was scribbling quickly, her brow furrowed in thought. Every so often, she paused to sip her coffee, then continued writing, as though capturing fleeting ideas before they escaped. David hesitated. He could have left with his drink, choosing not to intrude on the quiet sanctuary she seemed to create for herself. Yet something inside him urged him to stay, even if only for a moment. He chose a table nearby, pretending to scroll on his phone while stealing the occasional glance. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting soft light across her notebook. He noticed small details now, the way she tapped the pen lightly against the paper when thinking, the faint smile that curved her lips when a sentence pleased her. There was a calmness about her presence, a steadiness that contrasted with the whirlwind of his own days. At one point, she looked up, catching his gaze. It wasn't awkward, though it could have been. Instead, it felt almost natural, like acknowledging a familiar face in a crowd. She gave him a small smile, and he found himself smiling back before quickly lowering his eyes to his coffee. The encounter lasted no longer than a few minutes, but it planted something within him, a seed of possibility. For years, his world had revolved around responsibilities and quiet sacrifices, leaving little room for anything else. Yet here was a reminder that life had more to offer than survival. It could surprise him, even in the smallest of ways. As he left the cafe that morning, he carried with him not just his coffee, but a sense of anticipation. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But fate, it seemed, was giving him another chance to find out. The stranger with the notebook was no longer just a passing memory. She was becoming part of his present. And David, though cautious, could feel his heart beginning to open in ways it hadn't in years. The following week unfolded with its usual demands, yet David noticed subtle changes within himself. Each morning felt less like a hurried race and more like a possibility waiting to be discovered. His daughter's laughter at the breakfast table seemed brighter, his patience with traffic longer, and his walks into the schoolyard a little lighter. Beneath it all was a quiet knowledge that the cafe had become more than just a stop for caffeine. It had become a place where his heart felt something it hadn't in years. On Friday, he found himself back at the familiar coffee shop. The door chimed as he entered, the soft sound blending with the hum of quiet conversation. The stranger was there again, sitting by the same window with her notebook open, though today she looked different. Her usual calm expression was tinged with a hint of frustration, her pen resting motionless on the page. It was the first time he had seen her pause, almost as if words had abandoned her. David hesitated, but then gathered his courage. He approached the counter, ordered his coffee, and as he waited, his eyes kept drifting toward her. Something inside him urged him to act, not out of boldness, but out of empathy. He knew what it felt like to sit in silence, weighed down by thoughts you couldn't untangle. with his cup in hand. He chose not to retreat to his corner table. Instead, he walked toward her and gently asked if the seat across from her was taken. She looked up, surprised but not unkind. After a brief pause, she gave a small nod, and he sat down. The moment carried an unexpected ease. They didn't speak much at first. He sipped his coffee, she tapped her pen, and together they shared the quiet. But the silence wasn't heavy. It was gentle, like a calm between waves. Eventually, she scribbled something into her notebook, and her shoulders softened, as though relieved that inspiration had finally returned. David noticed a subtle change and felt oddly glad, as if simply being there had helped. For the first time in years, he wasn't just a father carrying burdens alone. He was a man capable of offering presence, even to a stranger. Over time, their unspoken companionship grew. On some mornings, they exchanged a polite nod of recognition. On others, they lingered long enough to share small smiles that held more weight than words. Slowly, the boundaries between strangers began to dissolve, and in their place bloomed something delicate: trust. One morning, she closed her notebook and looked directly at him. Her eyes held warmth, but also curiosity, as though silently asking who he was beyond the man with coffee in hand. David's heart tightened with a mix of nerves and hope. For years, he had carried his story quietly, afraid that no one outside his daughter could understand the sacrifices, the grief, and the small victories of single parenthood. Yet here was someone who seemed willing to listen, not out of pity, but out of genuine interest. It was in that moment, without a single word spoken, that David realized something profound. Love doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it whispers its way in through kindness, patience, and the willingness to simply sit with another soul. As the morning sun streamed across the cafe window, David felt a quiet certainty that this was not the end of their story. Something new was beginning, something fragile yet full of promise. The weeks that followed turned into a gentle rhythm, each morning carrying with it the quiet comfort of familiarity. David no longer entered the cafe as a weary father chasing caffeine. Instead, he walked in with a calm sense of belonging, knowing that the stranger by the window, no longer just a passing face, would be there. Their exchanges grew slowly, layered in small moments: a shared smile, a casual wave, the subtle joy of recognizing someone who had become a part of your day. It was his daughter who noticed first. Children, unburdened by caution, see truths adults often overlook. One morning, as David walked to school before heading to the cafe, she teased him lightly, asking why he always seemed happier after coffee these days. He brushed it off with a chuckle, but her words stayed with him, pressing against the walls he had built around his heart. For years, his love had been poured entirely into fatherhood, leaving little space for himself. But now, cracks were forming, soft, hopeful cracks that allowed light to filter through. One Saturday, he and his daughter stopped by the cafe together. She clutched his hand, curious about the place her father seemed to cherish so much. As they walked in, her eyes immediately found the woman at the window, notebook closed for once, as if she had been waiting. The stranger greeted them with a warm smile that reached her eyes, and David felt his daughter's grip tighten, as though sensing something significant in the air. They shared a table that morning, the three of them. David's daughter talked freely, her words spilling out in a stream of laughter and questions. The woman listened intently, responding with kindness that made the little girl's eyes shine. For the first time in a long while, David witnessed his daughter connecting with someone outside their small world of two. The sound of their laughter together was unlike anything he had heard since his wife's passing. It was healing, mending something invisible but deeply felt. Over time, these meetings became more frequent, evolving from quiet coincidences into intentional gatherings. Coffee cups turned into shared meals, and small conversations grew into deeper ones. David discovered her love for writing, the reason behind the notebook she carried. She, in turn, learned about his journey as a father, the struggles, the resilience, and the sacrifices that had shaped him. There was no rush, no grand declarations, just a steady unfolding of something tender and real. One evening, after tucking his daughter into bed, David sat quietly, reflecting on the path that had led him here. Life had not been easy. It had tested him, broken him, and forced him to rebuild piece by piece. Yet, in the midst of it all, love had found its way back, not through chance or grand gestures, but through spilled coffee, quiet mornings, and the kindness of a stranger who saw him not as a man defined by loss, but as someone still capable of love. The journey had begun with a mess on the cafe floor, but it ended with something far greater: a second chance at happiness, one he never thought he'd have. And as David looked toward the future, he realized that sometimes love doesn't knock loudly. Sometimes it sits quietly across from you, notebook in hand, waiting patiently until you're ready to see it.